This is a very special edition of our series, Exodus, the biblical Moses that Hollywood forgot. The climax of every filmed presentation. This is one passage that Hollywood absolutely cannot afford to forget. This is the passage regarding the crossing of the sea. So to set us up for the crossing of the sea, let us just set the stage. Previously, in Exodus, the biblical Moses that Hollywood forgot. We discussed them leaving Goshen around here, making their way down, and crossing the sea. Now, we discussed a variety of different places where they might cross. This tiny little lake over here, even smaller lake over here, a greater lake over here, all of these called seas in biblical times, but more likely to me is crossing right down here the Gulf of Suez. Any way you slice it, however, no matter where you place it, they crossed from Egypt through the Red Sea. And here we are in the passage. Chapter 14. The climax of the Exodus story. But oddly enough, not the climax of the book of Exodus. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Tell the sons of Israel, turn back and camp before Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdal and the sea. You shall camp in front of Baal Zephon, opposite it, by the sea." The intention was to be led in a way that Pharaoh's spies would see that appeared nonsensical, a suicidal route, in fact. And they would report back to the king. The Hebrews were wandering in circles, and for the final time, Pharaoh's heart is going to be hardened, which will cause him to change his mind one final time concerning the Hebrews' freedom. He will send his army to chase after them. For Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. They don't know where they're going. Their God is leading them in circles. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them. And I will be honored through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am, covenant name, Jehovah. I am the Lord. I am Adonai. I am the covenant God of Israel. As if they didn't know that already. 10 plagues later, have they not yet gotten the message? Apparently, this is a divine punctuation mark to the lesson that God has given the Egyptians. Look at the concern here is not for Israel's knowledge, but for Pharaoh and for the Egyptians especially. God is concerned for the Egyptian street. What is the concern? Not that they realize that they've been beaten, trounced 10 times, and this will be 11th, but that I am the true God. Just in case, out of sight means out of mind. We have to give them a lasting lesson that will continue with a gift that keeps on giving, that the God of Israel is the God, the true God, the only God of Egypt as well. Well, and they did so. And when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, which is exactly, you remember what Pharaoh and in his orders to Moses had instructed. He had demanded, he had driven them out. Pharaoh and his servants, not just Pharaoh, but his servants as well, had a change of heart toward the people. They literally changed their mind, they changed their heart, they changed their attitudes toward the people, which is another way of saying that how quickly they can change their attitudes regarding the people of Israel's God. They have a change of heart. The Egyptian people have a short memory, exceedingly short. But then again, as we read later on in Exodus, it seems that the Jewish people have the same problem, an exceedingly short memory. I wonder if any of us today in the church, no, well, not in this room, I know. Maybe out there in watching via camera. Maybe, yeah, you, but not here at Beth Sar Shalom. And Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart toward the people, and they ask, what is this that we have done? That we have let Israel go from serving us. So, on the one hand, we have now a mobilization of Egypt's great military machine that is going to afford Jehovah, our Lord, a final opportunity to impress his glory upon the Egyptian people. And so although the Egyptians had expelled the Hebrews from their nation, now the economic reality, and the subtext of this particular passage should not be surprising to any of us, it's the economy, stupid, right? And they realize that the economic reality of what they've lost, with their slave labor force now free and departed, permanent style, from their midst. The question arose as just who's going to set about the task of rebuilding Egypt's devastated cities? They are monumentally devastated because of the 10 plagues of Jehovah, and they realize the only way to fix the problem is to get those Hebrews back. So he made his chariot ready and took his people with him. Pharaoh himself is going out to lead the charge against the Hebrews. And he took 600 select chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. So again, that's not just 600 chariots. He's taking 600 the best chariots and other chariots as well. The ones that are, I guess, last year's model, I don't know, with officers over all of them. So chosen chariots and charioteers. The king and his army are going to travel much faster by chariot than the unwieldy Hebrew masses had on foot. And they're going to quickly overtake the slaves, former slaves, I should say, as they camp by the seaside. So we have the Lord hardening the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he chased after the sons of Israel as the sons of Israel were going out boldly. So we have two groups going out boldly, in martial array, if you will. Pharaoh and his chariots, the best of the best, and the Israelites as well, marching out in martial array. The King James, I believe, says they went out with a high hand. That means that the Hebrews were supremely confident in their position. But that confidence is going to swiftly evaporate momentarily. Once the children of Israel noticed the dramatic approach of Pharaoh's army in all its strength, then the Egyptians chased after them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen, his army, and they overtook them camping by the sea beside Pi-Hahirot in front of Baal Zephon. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And a group that had been marching boldly, confidently, supremely confidently, well, they became not just frightened, but exceedingly frightened, very frightened, intensification of their fright. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord in terror and surprise. But what do they cry out? Crying out to the Lord. That's good. It was a good move. But what they're crying out, however, is not a prayer of supplication, but a prayer of protest. They said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us this way, bringing us out of Egypt?" Now, this is extraordinary. They complain to Moses they would have been better off had they remained Egyptian property. And in this complaint that they now lodge, they are going to remind Moses that they had initially rejected his leadership. They had told him, don't rock the boat. Don't upset the apple cart. Don't upset the status quo. They're going to say, better for us to have served the Egyptians. In their mind, it would have been better to be a living slave than a dead freeman. Now, this one passage in chapter 14, verse 11, is one that I really absolutely adore. Because in the drama of the moment, it's easy to lose sight of the biting, bitter, ironic, and very, very Jewish humor that's apparent. Because what are they asking Moses? The rhetorical question is asked of Moses as to the need of the Hebrews to be buried in the desert because there is a lack of graves in Egypt. Egypt has nothing but graves. The pyramids themselves, the big ones and the little ones. And those in between, these are monumental graves. Everywhere. You know what you go to see in Egypt today? You go to, I'll tell you, you're not going to see the great metropolis that is Cairo. You're going to see the necropolises of Egypt. And everywhere you look, this is the tomb of this pharaoh, and this is the tomb of this pharaoh, and this is the tomb of this Mrs. Pharaoh, and this is the grave of the entire population of this particular. There's nothing in Egypt to see but graves. Well, and the Suez Canal is also good to see. But this is a nation that prides itself, and by the time that Moses and the Hebrews had left Egypt, pyramids themselves, like 1,000 years old. Right? They are to be a nation that has studied its landscape with the most extravagant and elaborate graves in the world. So when the Jews asked Moses, is it because there's no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to the desert? I myself, I don't hear a Hollywood version. I hear a Brooklyn version. I hear a Jewish version that I know all too well. The Jewish people, we love our wine, by which I mean W-H-I-N-E. Well, let's continue. Is this not the word we spoke to? Didn't we tell you? This is the other thing that Jewish people do, right? I learned this at a very early age, you know. Sorry, Pop. Is this not the word that did I not tell you so? I told you so. Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? Better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Moses responds with a twofold command for the people. Command number one, these are imperatives. Command number one, fear not. Command number two, imperative number two, stand still. Actually, let me add a third one. Hold your peace. So let's put this in plain English. Fear not, stand still, shut up. Okay. And a fourth one, watch. Watch. And that, frankly, is actually pretty good advice. And that's advice that I think stands the test of time. Because many of us, listen, very few of us have found ourselves in situations like the Hebrews found themselves in chapter 14. But nonetheless, many of us truly find ourselves in life circumstances. We find ourselves in desperate straits. And we have metaphorically, on one end, chariots of our enemies impending and approaching upon us, impending doom. And On the other side of us, the metaphorical nowhere to go, caught between the rock and the hard place. We'll cry out to God. We fear. We respond like human beings with fear and sometimes lashing out in blame and whining. But the advice that Moses commands his people, don't fear, don't be afraid. It's good advice. Stand still. That's also, because you know what? Most of us, when we're in these kinds of situations, you know what we're doing? Running around like chickens without heads. Right? And a chicken without a head is interesting to watch from a distance. But if you're the chicken, not so entertaining. Right? Better to stand still. Fear not, stand still. Close your mouth, open your eyes. I remember way back in college, I was watching this, Ten Commandments shows every year on TV. And when I was in college, I watched it as well every year. And I was in a dorm room with my friend, and she had her roommate was also watching, and the boyfriend of the roommate was in there watching as well, watching a little tiny, TV, college. And my favorite scene, the parting the Red Sea, is about to come up, and this guy can't keep his mouth shut about how silly it is and what a fairy tale it is. So I remembered the words of Moses, and I said, sit down, shut up, and open your eyes, okay? I felt very biblical, frankly, and he did. I wasn't dating him, it didn't matter. But Moses says, do not fear. Stand by. Stand still. And see the salvation, and watch. See the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, that you are so fearful of, after today, you will never see them again. And when I say never see them again, I mean in the forever sense. Never see them again. That's what the text says. You will never see them again forever. There's an intensification there to make sure the people will understand. And the reason that the people are to take courage was that not one approaching Egyptian is ever going to be seen by them again. They were to be passive in their actions. The only action they were to take was to stand firm and watch the Lord fight this battle on their behalf. Because this day, yes, this day they would see the salvation of the Lord, his mighty, his unprecedented deliverance of his people. And what is about to unfold in this text is the greatest act of redemption the world had ever seen to that point, and it retains that record for another 1,500 years, surpassed only by the death, burial, and resurrection of our Messiah. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. Wouldn't that be a nice prayer to pray? A nice verse to memorize. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent. You know, we have all kinds of opposition. Christians, people of faith, have all manner of opposition in our society. And our first response, our first instinct, is to respond with action. We're Americans, after all, and we take action. We're a people of action. And so we see some nasty comment on Facebook or on social media, and our immediate instinct is to respond and say, oh, no, it's not like that, it's like this. And you're drawn into this interaction where, let me tell you something, every time I've been drawn into an interaction regarding Facebook or any kind of social media, Nobody wins that. Okay? It's an unwinnable thing. Don't waste your time. You keep silent. The Lord will fight for you. And that goes beyond Facebook and social media, other things as well, I think it's a very good principle. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me?" To which Moses said, "Are you not listening? It's the people who are crying out to me." Wait a minute. No. Apparently, what we're missing in the text here is that Moses began then, after telling the people, chill, he began to intercede on their behalf as their intercessor, as their representative, as their leader, as their deliverer. He began to intercede before the Lord. But during his intercession on behalf of his people, God himself interrupts Moses mid-intercession and tells him, "You too, shh. Stop praying." God tells Moses to stop praying. Because now it's time for the God of heaven and earth, the creator of all, to roll up his sleeves. And as the great poet once said, when he rolls up his sleeves, he ain't just putting on the Ritz. Our God is an awesome God. Tell the sons of Israel to go forward. And he directs Moses to instruct the Hebrews to press toward the sea. As for you, Moses, lift up your staff and stretch your hand over the sea and divide it. Say what? Divide it. And the sons of Israel shall go through the midst of the sea on dry land. God is going to cause the waters to divide and create. Now watch those words. It's very, very important because here's the miracle. They're going to go through the midst of the sea on dry land. Because the miracle is not just that the waters are going to part. That's a pretty nifty miracle, we have to all agree. But there's a second component of that miracle, which is that the seabed, which should be muck and mire, is dry land. So don't forget the two parts. You've got the walls of water, the separation of the water, and you also have the dry land. Without one, with just one without the other, you don't have an escape. You don't have redemption. You don't have a deliverance. As for me, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will be honored. I will be brought glory, in other words, through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. It's not going to be willingly given glory from the Egyptians, but nonetheless, God will receive honor. Then the Egyptians will know. Again, the concern for the Egyptian street, the Egyptian populace. They will know. And those especially soldiers in the sea, they're going to know, and how, that I am Jehovah. I am the covenant God. I am the only true God. And they're going to know back home when I'm honored through Pharaoh, through his chariots, and his horsemen. And the angel of God who had been going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood before them. The angel of God is another term for the angel of the Lord. We see this term throughout the Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament. When we see the angel of God or the angel of the Lord in Scripture, it is generally an indication that we are seeing God himself. I believe what we're seeing here is the second person of the Trinity appearing, his presence within the Shekinah glory, which is manifesting as, on the one hand, a pillar of dark cloud, which then moves from its normative position before Israel to behind them. The pillar had been leading them. It now takes up their flank. It takes up their rear. Directly between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. And the side of the cloud that faces the Egyptian army brings darkness. But the opposite side that faces toward the Hebrews behind them is going to shine brightly. And that bright light is going to enable the Hebrews to travel all night through the depths of the sea. It will allow the Hebrews time to escape, for all the men, women, children, the animals, to cross the pathway through the Red Sea. It came between the camp of Egypt, the camp of Israel. There was the cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. And though the one did not come near the other all night. I want to show you two versions of Hollywood's depiction of this event, and we're going to compare and contrast Hollywood's version. Two really good ones. I mean, these are like the best. There were multiple choices to choose from, multiple selections to choose from, 5 or 6 that are readily available depictions, but these are the two that I think are the closest and the best to the text itself. Let's take a quick look at both of these. Okay, so what we saw there is a pillar of fire. Now, what's different about what Hollywood did there in that very dramatic and well-done cartoon, animated feature? What's different about what the text describes and what we saw in the film? Anyone? It's just a pillar of fire. We don't get the distinction between, maybe they thought visually it's more dramatic to just have fire separating, but the Bible, the text, tells us it's darkness on the Egyptian side. This is not a single pillar. This is a multifaceted pillar. Light on one side. If you want to present it as fire, that's fine. Whatever, light. And darkness on the other. The Egyptians are stymied not because they're afraid of fire, they can't see. And this passage, of course, this film does not give us the complaints of the Hebrews that we see in the text and the various different responses. Let's see another version. How did this one fare? How did Hollywood's version in the Ten Commandments fare against the text? What did it do right? What did it miss? What did it do wrong? What did it miss out on? All right, again, the darkness on the one side, which I think is so much more dramatic, and in both instances with the technology of 1956, when you're just animating, even in regular film, you're animating this. Okay, maybe they didn't have technology, whatever, to be able to do anything more than just a pillar of fire. Got it. But even when you have the technology of the animation of the Prince of Egypt, you're still going with fire, as opposed to, I think, the more dramatic and the more spectacular, darkness on the one side, same pillar, darkness on one side and fire on the other. And then, of course, you have, in this instance, you have a great representation, a great fleshing out of the rebellion that is breaking out and the lack of faith that the Hebrews are experiencing, and Moses himself telling them, stand still and move backwards toward the sea. So there's a couple of hits and a miss or two in both of these films. But nonetheless, they're generally faithful. They give you the idea. But I think in both instances, believe it or not, the text itself, the narrative within the text, these very words, simple and direct and athletically presented as they are still more exciting. Part of the biblical Moses that Hollywood forgot, even in the most dramatic of times. Well, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, And the Lord swept the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, so that the waters were divided. So, this is the moment that every Moses film builds up to. And as you can see, they linger over the sea. This is the biggest shot of the film. This is the most important moment. When we get to the moment in the text, you get this narrative description in verse 21 of how the Red Sea parted. It's terse. It's abbreviated. Rather than cultivating the high spectacle, the drama of the kind of climactic cinema scene that we've just seen, the narrative proceeds with very matter-of-fact statement. It's very matter-of-fact. God's salvation activity betrays no drama, no hint of divine exertion or strain. If God were personified in any of these films, it would be big and dramatic in the same way that Heston's Moses is big, dramatic, and it's a big sea. For God, splitting the Red Sea and creating this avenue of escape is literally no big deal for him. For the Hebrews, it's a huge deal. But as far as his actions, his activity, no exertion, no strain, no sweat. Moses stretches his staff across the water, and the Lord simply causes a strong east wind to blow throughout the evening, a gale that results in the division of the sea down the center. Now the question is whether the wind blew all night, and only after the night is over was the sea sufficiently parted, or whether the wind is blowing and continuing to keep the sea apart so that the Hebrews can continue. It doesn't actually say. Okay? It's hard to see because there's not a lot of text here. And again, two components to this miracle. Don't miss them. Separation of the water, number one. And second is the bottom of the seabed is dry land, which is very conducive to rapid travel as opposed to sea muck. Right? And then into this rift in the sea. How wide was it? I don't know. Maybe 1/8 of a mile wide? I don't know. No idea how wide it was. Enough. It's wide enough. That's the answer. The Hebrews proceed. And on either side of the Hebrews, as they process, and it takes them quite a while to get across, right? A massive wall of water. What is holding the walls of water on either side of the Hebrews, who are in the most vulnerable position possible? What's holding the walls of water back? What's holding them in check? Only the power of God. But it's more than sufficient. Then the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. So what follows in the narrative now provides an excellent indication for us, the reader, of just how hardened was Pharaoh. Okay, so hardened and so troubled that he plunges his army into the midst of this sea. Right? Dawning light of day, morning watch, spans the 4 hours from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. The Lord had allowed the Egyptians to see beyond the pillar of, remember the darkness. Right? They see beyond the pillar of cloud, the darkness parts. They see the Hebrews crossing through the midst of the divided sea. I find it incomprehensible, and yet on the other hand, it is such human nature for the Egyptians to fail to realize one more time, yet again, that mighty Jehovah was supernaturally intervening on behalf of his people. You would think by now they would have seen a pattern develop over the course of 10 plagues. Each and every time the Egyptians had witnessed this sort of supernatural activity in the recent past, every time they see God doing supernatural activity on behalf of the Hebrews, it's never worked out so well for the Egyptians. Instead of concluding what a reasonable people and a reasonable leader would have concluded, that when it comes to standing toe-to-toe with the Lord of the Israelites, Jehovah, discretion is the better part of valor. Instead, they decide to pursue the Hebrews into the midst of the sea. At the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. So the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." So as the chariots begin to follow them, proceeding along the pathway in the sea in hot pursuit, as they say, the dry ground I made such a big deal of in the text begins to turn into mud. And bogging down in the muck, the chariot wheels began to come off. What they should have perceived all along, that the Hebrews have a powerful patron who fights for them against the Egyptians. They finally get this, but regrettably for the Egyptians, they have this eureka moment of insight. Too late. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may come back over the Egyptian, over their chariots, and over their horsemen." By now the Hebrews had arrived safely on the far shore of the sea. God commands Moses, "Take your staff over the divided sea so that the waters can reunite." And the horror that we read of in 27 is palpable. Moses stretched out his hand, in obedience, of course, over the sea. And the sea, again, no drama, just straight narrative, say a straight description. But I read this with horror. The sea returned to its normal state at daybreak, while the Egyptians were fleeing right into it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The two walls of water begin to collapse upon the Egyptians, and the Egyptians, realizing their impending doom, nonetheless attempt to escape their fate, but escape proves impossible as the deluge completely washes over Pharaoh's military force, covering them completely, so the sea returns to its proper level, leaving no survivors. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen, even Pharaoh's entire army that had gone into the sea after them. Not even one of them remained. A horror. But the sons of Israel walked on dry land through the midst of the sea, and the waters were like a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Strong contrast. The horror, the glory, the power of God, the redemption of God. You strong contrast. On the one hand, Egyptians, a very soggy fate. But the Egyptians, or the Hebrews rather, both dry and secure. And they camp along the sea, tired, of course, understandably. And they begin to witness the bodies of the Egyptian soldiers washing up on the shore. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And now we come to the moment we've all been waiting for, 14 chapters, and I don't know how many months since we started Exodus. Let's watch 2 of Hollywood's best depictions of this event, side by side. What did the Prince of Egypt version bring that represented the story with accuracy? What did it leave out? Anything? Any of you? What did you notice from the text versus how they fleshed it out? Did they represent it correctly? David, what? Right. Okay, so Pharaoh, yes. Right. Well, Moses is told in the text to hold the staff up. Stretch forth your staff. Heston does that, and he does this as well, and then dramatically brings it down like Thor banging his hammer. Okay. Both of them have a dramatic splitting of the sea, yes? Yeah, you notice what I liked about the Prince of Egypt version, and again, for me, these are the number 1 and number 2 greatest cinematic moments in history, so I love them both very much. I saw one as an 8-year-old boy for the first time, and I saw one as a grown man, and both of them moved me tremendously. Power of God, represented on film. It's the power of film to see as well. But even the power of film has its limitations. But what I liked about the Prince of Egypt is that the Shekinah glory, that pillar, even though it was just represented as fire, nonetheless, you see the Shekinah glory, that pillar is waiting for them on the other end. It is crossed over, and it's waiting for them to lead them to safety. Of course, in this instance, Moses doesn't do anything to stretch out his hand. In either film, I don't think, Moses stretches out his hand. God literally does all the heavy lifting by himself, I guess to make Moses seem like more of a good guy cinematically. I don't know exactly why they do that, but they avoid having Moses take the fall for the deaths of all the Egyptians. It's God's response. God saved and God judged. It's all God in the films, and that's okay with me. I like the darkness of traveling through the sea. If you're traveling through walls of water, yes, and you're traveling through at night, then yes, it would be dark. Absolutely would be dark, and so I like that depiction as well. Yes, Rennie? Yeah, but it wouldn't be as dramatic if the Shekinah was with them the whole time. It's better for them to be, that's the movie, you make a decision when you're filming this stuff. But were both of those, the question is, were both of those, neither of those, 1 and 1, were they faithful to the text? Did they capture the narrative force of what's going on, what Moses expresses in the text of Exodus? Yeah, I think by far Exodus. Let me just see a show of hands. How many of you prefer the 10 Commandments version of the sea crossing to the Prince of Egypt? So how many are for the 10 Commandments? Okay. And how many for the Prince of Egypt's presentation? Wow, that's like split decision. Okay, which is just fine because I like them both. Again, number 1, number 2. But in both instances, Moses is a sufficiently strong individual. The Hebrews do what the Hebrews are supposed to do, and ultimately the Egyptians do what they are depicted as having done. And we get to the conclusion of this first chapter, if you will, in the story of the Exodus. So if you think about Exodus 1 through 14, it's a very short amount of time relatively. Of course, actually, you have a 40-year gap in there, and 40 years of Moses growing up that we don't see in the text. The text just skips over. But we're going to see now, through the rest of Exodus, we're going to see a tremendous amount of time in the wilderness where these Hebrews, who are just starting their journey, think about how exciting it is to have your life literally turned upside down. All you have known is a life of slavery, and now you have been redeemed by the God of your forefathers, who is literally in front of you, leading you every step of the way, opening the way before you, having redeemed you with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Can you imagine what that feels like? You should be able to imagine what, because that's exactly what happened to each one of us. Each one of us were enslaved to sin, but through the power of our God, through the death, and burial, and resurrection, the power of Yeshua's resurrection, Jesus' resurrection, we have been saved if we but trust. Would any Hebrew have been saved from Egypt if they didn't take the step forward into the sea? No. That step of faith. If you have not yet taken that step of faith in trusting God, what are you waiting for? In this room or watching this message? What are you waiting for? Today is the day of salvation.